So we've been talking about firms in a perfectly competitive market, which means we're going to need to take care of some vocabulary first. What is a competitive market? Well, the problem with econ is oftentimes we define things by their features. So a competitive market is one that has many buyers and sellers who are buying and selling a similar good or service. In other words, the firms that exist in these markets are price takers. And a price taker is a firm that takes or understands the market price as given. And this is determined, in other words, the price in this market is not determined by this individual firm, but by the overall supply and demand conditions in this market, which is why it's so important that we characterize what the supply curve looks like in these perfectly competitive markets. Now, in these markets, we're going to see something called free entry and exit. There are no barriers to entry. So later in this class, we're going to be talking about what if we, as Econ 101, run a newspaper. Well, let's suppose there's free entry and exit in the newspaper. That means we can start running our newspaper whenever we want. We don't have to get licensed. We don't have to be bonded or insured. We can enter the market freely. Now, it's important to remember that markets like this rarely exist. For instance, I'm a professor. In order to become a professor, I had to get a PhD. That's 5 years at graduate school. I had to get a postdoc. That's another 3 years. Similarly, doctors go through medical school, they go through residency, they go through fellowships and internships. These markets do not have free entry and exit, and we'll see later that that affords the actors in these markets some level of market power. Now, a competitive market is one in which these characteristics hold: many buyers and sellers, similar goods, implying that the firms are price takers, and ones without barriers to entry. But this is just an ideal model. We are looking at markets as if these characteristics hold. And if these characteristics hold, we're going to see that surplus consumer welfare is going to be maximized in this market. Now, next chapter, we will be diverting from this model a little bit. And for those of you who are interested in the frictions in this model, be sure to take my experimental economics class next spring. So what is a perfectly competitive market? It's one with lots of buyers and sellers, similar goods, price-taking firms, and no barriers to entry. So let's see some examples of quote-unquote perfectly competitive markets and explore what aspects make them competitive and how they might fall short of the perfectly competitive model. So though it hasn't been described in our textbook so far, with these markets, there is an assumption of perfect information. Let's take the concept of price taking from the last slide. What does that assumption of perfect information mean? It means that everyone knows everyone's cost and benefits. So let's talk about price taking. Well, I have to ship something later today, and I can go to UPS or I can go to FedEx. Now, are UPS and FedEx price takers in this market? What would happen if UPS raised their prices a whole bunch? I would just go down the street to FedEx, and same thing, vice versa. So what it says is these two firms don't really have a lot of control over market price. They don't have a lot of market power. They have to behave according to market conditions. So let's look at some of these examples and see where the markets are or competitive and where they're less competitive. So we might see an example of a stock market. And one of the important things about stock market that makes it a greater example of a competitive firm is that the shares are perfectly similar. So your share of Google is the exact same as my share of Google. There's no difference between them. Now, in a stock market, we have millions of shares of stock traded, lots of buyers and sellers. Those buyers and sellers have access to perfect information. We have an open ledger. What stock price is literally just the price of the most recent trade. And because each of the traders are only a small share of the people trading, they have little ability to influence the market price. But what might make them uncompetitive is the fact that there are large institutional investors, people like Vanguard or BlackRock, and these investors can influence the market price. On the other side, stock markets are very big markets. Farmers markets are very small markets. Sellers are able to set up with little or no cost. There are few barriers to entry. And for the most part, your oranges look like my oranges. Your onions look like my onions. The goods are very similar. So the market price tends to converge towards a similar price. Think about your experience at a farmer's market. If my apples look like your apples, and my apples are more expensive than your apples, where are people going to buy apples from? Where this situation gets misconstrued is that there's not a lot of buyers and sellers at a farmer's market. And maybe one apple stand is all the way across the way from the other apple stand. Maybe someone has market power either by actually having better apples or by being at a prime spot, one that happens to be close to the parking lot or close to some amenity. The fact that there are fewer vendors, some of these individual vendors can control the market somewhat, can set higher prices. So for the next couple lectures in this chapter, we're going to consider our own business, our class newspaper, the Econ 101 Post, and we're going to consider this business to ask how firms are actually maximizing profits. And again, we mean economic profit, not accounting profit. We mean profit that takes opportunity cost into account. So suppose we run this class newspaper, the Economics 101 Post, and in this market, we are a price taker. We take the market price as given, and all our job is to do is to decide quantity, to decide how many newspapers we need to print in order to maximize the profit. In other words, for the next couple lectures, we are going to derive a firm's profit maximizing rule.